72 hours ago, NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter captured something moving against the crimson haze of the Martian sky, something that shouldn't have been there. When astronomers stacked the images, the outline wasn't round like a comet's halo. It was sharp, angular, metallic. Then, silence. NASA's public channels froze. The official explanation: government shutdown. But here's the strange part. The European Space Agency had images too. They released one, a blurry white dot barely visible against the stars, and called it the closest view yet. Why release an image they knew would reveal nothing? According to Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb, the energy signature from 3I Atlas doesn't match any known comet model. Its light curve shows active maneuvering, a comet that turns itself. In less than 3 weeks, it will slip behind the sun, vanishing from every telescope on Earth. When it reappears, it might no longer be what we think it is. What happens when a comet acts like a probe? If you find this fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe to Science at Night. Tell me where you're listening from, what time it is there, and whether you believe 3I Atlas is really natural or something built. Share this episode on X, Facebook, Reddit, wherever you want. Let's see who's still paying attention when it comes back out. Chapter 1. The Leak That Changed Everything. 48 hours after the first Mars images dropped, an anonymous post appeared on a private data forum known for hosting scientific leaks. The title was short, almost clinical. 3I Atlas, Thermal Deviation Report. At first, it looked like another pseudo-scientific hoax. But the attached data set, time-stamped, geotagged, with references to ESA and NASA telemetry, was too precise to ignore. Whoever uploaded it had access to restricted files, the kind only research partners or mission analysts could see. The report contained a single chilling graph, a fluctuating heat signature measured from the object over a 36-hour window. Every 8 minutes, the thermal output spiked, regular, rhythmic, like a machine cycling power. Comets don't do that. For the next few hours, the file spread across encrypted chat groups and astronomy subreddits faster than moderators could delete it. One user mirrored it to a public cloud. Within minutes, it was gone. The account was suspended, but not before thousands had downloaded it. A comment beneath the original post read simply, "It's alive," or at least awake. That's when the mainstream science community started paying attention. Dr. Mira Kellen, a plasma physicist with the European Space Agency, tweeted, "If these figures are authentic, we're not looking at a comet, we're looking at engineering." Her post vanished less than an hour later. When reporters reached out, ESA declined to comment, citing internal review. But the silence only amplified the noise. Independent analysts began verifying the leaked data against open-source observations. Amateur astronomers compared timestamps with their own measurements and confirmed subtle brightness fluctuations at the same intervals, 8 minutes apart. The odds of coincidence? Less than 1 in 10 million. Something was pulsing out there. Then came the second leak. A user under the handle Atlas Probe, Shachar Leak, uploaded a compressed folder labeled Cassis High Gain Test. Inside were 4 low-resolution frames taken by ESA's Trace Gas Orbiter. At first glance, they showed nothing more than the familiar fuzzy smudge. But when contrast was enhanced, thin lines appeared, perfectly straight, crossing the comet's nucleus like seams. Lines of symmetry and space are rare. In nature, randomness rules. These looked manufactured. The uploader wrote one sentence under the images: "Not a comet, a cover." NASA's official response came 12 hours later. A coordinated misinformation campaign is spreading unverified material related to 3I Atlas. No evidence supports claims of artificial origin. That should have ended it. It didn't. In fact, it made things worse. Because buried deep inside NASA's own data archive, hidden in a public folder used for unrelated Mars weather analysis, users found a single stray file, TMA325.raw. When processed, it revealed a thermal pattern matching the leak exactly. 8-minute pulses. Consistent, precise. You can fake images, you can't fake physics. Suddenly the story wasn't just about a fuzzy comet. It was about why NASA was sitting on data that confirmed an engineered heat pattern and why no one inside the agency was talking. A retired systems engineer named Thomas Greer, who once worked on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter's camera systems, gave an interview to an independent science channel. "You don't get oscillations like that from sublimating ice. That's power regulation. Something is managing heat actively, turning itself on and off." Within hours, his LinkedIn disappeared. Greer wasn't the only one to go quiet. A small research team at Caltech, known for monitoring interstellar objects, suddenly pulled their preprint paper from arXiv without explanation. The cached version had one striking line: "Spectral lines suggest high-frequency modulation inconsistent with known cometary processes. Possible non-natural source." When asked for comment, the lead author, Dr. L. Richardson, replied with 2 words: "No comment." Meanwhile, the object continued its slow drift behind the sun. Observatories tracking it noticed faint adjustments in trajectory, subtle but deliberate, not random outgassing. Vector shifts, like corrections. By the 3rd week of October, 3 independent observatories, one in Chile, one in South Africa, one in Arizona, reported the same anomaly: a small burst of blue light from the object's direction. It lasted less than 2 seconds. At first, they assumed instrumental glitch, but when all 3 recorded it within the same 4-second window, the coincidence became impossible to dismiss. Blue light, high energy, precise timing. Whatever 3i Atlas was, it wasn't just reflecting sunlight, it was emitting something. And then, as if to confirm the growing suspicion, the European Space Agency quietly postponed a scheduled press briefing. A single sentence on their website read, "Due to data verification concerns, today's 3i Atlas update will be rescheduled." No new date was given. By then, the theory had already escaped containment. On social media, hashtags like "our alien probe" and "our Atlas awakens" were trending across multiple countries. Amateur sleuths began dissecting every pixel, every data point. Reddit threads ballooned into thousands of comments, most of them arguing not whether it was artificial, but why it was here. Some said reconnaissance. Others said communication. A few whispered something darker, that it wasn't observing. It was searching. When I reached out to Dr. Kellen again through an encrypted channel, her reply was short. "Whatever this thing is, it behaves like it's been here before." I asked her what she meant. She sent a single link, an archived paper from 1983 describing an unidentified interstellar body that passed undetected by optical telescopes but left a magnetic trace near Jupiter. The paper's authors were never identified. It ended with one line: "The signal repeated once, 37 years later, from a different direction." That direction was exactly where 3i Atlas entered our system, and if the pattern holds, the next pulse isn't due for another 8 minutes. Right now. Chapter 2. The structure beneath the ice. When the second leak surfaced, it didn't come from a scientist or an anonymous whistleblower. It came from space itself. 3 days after the thermal data appeared, a group of independent astronomers at the Atacama Observatory in Chile published an analysis that no one expected. Using near-infrared spectroscopy, they detected something buried deep within the coma of 3i Atlas, something that reflected light in a way no natural ice or dust should. A narrow band of reflection near 1.4 microns showed a clean, repeated pattern. Every scientist who saw it recognized the signature immediately. It looked like alloy, but that wasn't the headline. The headline was what happened next. NASA's Open Data Portal, which automatically mirrored all uploaded comet spectra, went offline without warning. The message on the screen was simple: server undergoing maintenance. It stayed down for 26 hours. When it came back online, the file, cataloged as Atlas NIR 1437A, was gone. No backup, no trace. But the internet never forgets. Someone had already saved it. The file appeared again on a mirrored server hosted in Iceland, and within minutes, it was spreading across forums and encrypted drives. This time, the file didn't just contain raw numbers. It contained a spectral overlay, an image that, when converted into false color visualization, revealed something impossible. A geometric lattice beneath the ice, thin intersecting lines forming hexagonal grids, regular spacing, consistent depth. Natural crystal growth doesn't do that. The angles were too exact, 60 degrees, perfect, repeating like circuitry frozen inside stone. When Dr. Arjun Bhattacharya, a materials scientist at the Indian Institute of Astrophysics, reviewed the data, his first reaction was disbelief. "If those readings are real," he said during a live stream, "you're looking at engineered material, not mineral. Something built to survive deep cold and radiation for millions of years." Within 12 hours, his video was flagged for potential misinformation and disappeared from YouTube. By now, the 3i Atlas story had mutated. What began as curiosity had become obsession. The question was no longer whether the object was natural. The question was how long it had been traveling and who sent it. That's when someone noticed the alignment. When plotted backward, the object's trajectory crossed the exact coordinates of the WOW signal, detected from the constellation Sagittarius in 1977. The math was clean, almost too clean. If the object had been traveling at its measured velocity for that long, it would have passed near the origin of that signal 48 years ago. Not near, through. It was like the universe had drawn a straight line between a mysterious radio burst and a visiting object pretending to be a comet. Coincidence? Maybe. Except that the probe, if that's what it was, appeared to have responded. A team in Finland, monitoring the same infrared bands, recorded a faint repeating pulse exactly every 8 minutes and 43 seconds, the same rhythm identified in the original thermal data. The amplitude varied slightly, like modulation, like data. They ran it through signal analysis software. The result wasn't random noise. It was structured. Bits and pauses, ones and zeros. Digital. The astronomers stayed silent for 2 days. Then one of them, Dr. Eni Saarinen, broke ranks. In an interview with YLE Science, she admitted they had translated the first sequence into binary text. When decoded, it produced a repeating phrase in ASCII. One more cycle. The interview aired once. It was never rebroadcast. Saarinen resigned the following morning. The deeper we looked, the stranger it got. 3i Atlas wasn't melting the way a comet should. Its surface temperature held steady, even as solar radiation increased. No new jets of gas, no expanding coma, no fragmentation. It was behaving like something maintaining its own thermal balance, as if insulated from the inside. The European Southern Observatory released a brief statement claiming the anomalies were instrumental artifacts. But their own engineers leaked internal memos suggesting otherwise. The sensors weren't malfunctioning, the data was too consistent. One technician wrote, "If this is an artifact, it's the most disciplined artifact in history." Then came the radar echo. A high-frequency radar sweep from the Chinese Tianwen-1 orbiter returned a reflection anomaly. A hollow region roughly 2 kilometers wide inside the nucleus. Perfectly spherical. The density calculations didn't match any known comet composition. In fact, they didn't match any known natural material. That was the moment the narrative collapsed. News outlets scrambled for explanations. Hydrogen pockets, volcanic vents, data corruption. But off the record, multiple engineers admitted what the math implied. There was an internal cavity with smooth walls and symmetrical cross-sections, not random, designed. By mid-October, public confidence in official statements had evaporated, social feeds filled with speculation, animations, and 3D reconstructions. Some showed a hollow shell rotating around an invisible core. Others depicted a metallic probe disguised under layers of ice. Hashtags trended for days. Atlas probe, the shell, inside the comet. Through it all, NASA maintained silence. Then, on October 20th, a leaked internal memo appeared on a whistleblower platform. The document referenced unexplained polarization data and a structural echo inconsistent with porous ice models. It ended with a chilling line. If confirmed, The object demonstrates features consistent with deliberate engineering. The authenticity of the memo was never verified, but by then, truth and rumor were indistinguishable. That night, amateur astronomer Helena Ruiz in Madrid captured a frame unlike any before. Using a stacked exposure technique, she recorded a faint glimmer deep inside the coma, a triangular shadow that rotated slightly from frame to frame. When overlaid sequentially, it looked like a slow-moving aperture, a door. She uploaded it under the title, "Something Opens." The clip reached 2 million views before sunrise. Then it vanished. When I reached out to Helena through encrypted chat, she sent a single message before deleting her account. The pattern in the light. It matches a Fibonacci spiral. Nothing natural aligns that perfectly. For the first time, even the skeptics hesitated. Was 3I Atlas not a comet at all, but a vessel, a machine that had crossed interstellar space under a mask of dust and ice? And if so, had it just opened? By the end of October, every major observatory had orders to suspend public updates. The official reason, solar conjunction interference. But the timing was too neat. Exactly when the object reached its closest point behind the sun, the moment when it could do anything unseen, every feed went dark. We don't know what happened while it was hidden. All we know is that when 3I Atlas emerged again, something had changed. The light curve no longer matched previous data. The pulse interval was gone. The object was fainter, quieter, as if the probe, after one more cycle, had finally powered down, or sent what it came to send. Chapter 3. The Frequency. Nobody expected. For nearly a week after 3I Atlas disappeared behind the sun, the world forgot to blink. News anchors spoke its name like a prayer. NASA's silence stretched into a void big enough for 1,000 theories to live inside. But while the public stared at blank feeds, a handful of radio telescopes kept listening. And that's when the hum began. It started as background noise, barely above the cosmic hiss that radio astronomers filter out every day, a shallow, oscillating tone at 1.42 gigahertz. That frequency is sacred in astronomy. The hydrogen line, the fundamental note of the universe, the one frequency no natural process should modulate. Hydrogen is everywhere. But messages riding on top of hydrogen, that's deliberate. The signal came first from the Allen Telescope Array in Northern California, then from the Meerkat Observatory in South Africa. Hours later, ALMA in Chile confirmed it. The same narrow band fluctuation, sweeping every 8 minutes and 43 seconds, exactly matching the thermal pulse pattern that started this entire story. Coincidence? The universe doesn't do rhythm. Dr. Joanna Lee, a data scientist with the SETI Institute, went public before anyone could stop her. "If this were interference," she said during a live stream, "it wouldn't repeat at precise astronomical intervals. Something out there is syncing with hydrogen itself." Within 12 hours, her access credentials were revoked and the stream deleted. A replacement statement appeared on SETI's homepage. No confirmed detections at this time. But the world had already seen the waveform, an elegant rising curve followed by a perfect exponential decay. It looked like a heartbeat written in radio. 3 nights later, I was on a call with Dr. Lee. Her voice was calm, the way people sound when they've seen too much. "The frequency isn't just repeating," she said. "It's drifting. Drifting upward, by exactly 0.0003 hertz per pulse. Not random noise, not Doppler shift from orbit. It was acceleration." "Acceleration of what?" I asked. She paused. "Of intention." Those words never made it into any transcript. Meanwhile, engineers at the Deep Space Network quietly noticed something stranger. One of their transmitters near Canberra, Australia, had begun receiving ghost echoes, faint reflections bouncing back 8 minutes after every test transmission. The echoes were identical to their outgoing pings but inverted, as if someone, or something, were mirroring the signal from a distance of roughly 1 astronomical unit. The direction matched the predicted position of 3I Atlas behind the sun. Mirror comms, a reply that wasn't a reply, just a reflection, distorted enough to whisper, "I hear you. NASA classified the finding within 24 hours. Technicians signed non-disclosure forms. The file vanished from the DSN public log, but an archived screenshot leaked through an internal forum. A clean spike labeled "Return Signal Confirmed." That was the night the conspiracy left the internet and walked into the real world. Governments moved fast. The U.S. Air Force Space Command issued a no-fly zone over specific longitudes, citing solar interference. European ground stations rerouted their satellite dishes. And for the first time since the Cold War, NASA, ESA, and Roscosmos scheduled a joint classified meeting under the codename Project Echo 9. No press, no live stream. Just 3 agencies deciding how to talk about something that might already be talking back. Inside the scientific community, debate turned violent, career-ending violent. Half insisted the signal was interstellar interference, maybe reflections from solar plasma. The other half whispered the unthinkable. We've been pinged. A young postdoc from Cambridge, Mira Ahmed, published a paper that lasted online for less than an hour. Title: Thermal Synchronization and Hydrogen Modulation in 3I Atlas, Evidence of Controlled Emission. Her conclusion was blunt. The object demonstrates adaptive resonance behavior consistent with artificial frequency management. She was expelled from her research group the next day. But numbers don't lie. The pulse interval shortened again, 8 minutes, then 7:59. The amplitude doubled. And embedded in the noise floor, analysts discovered something they almost missed. Secondary harmonics spaced exactly at the Fibonacci sequence. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. Over and over, encoded into light. Helena Ruiz, the same amateur who filmed the triangular aperture, ran a Fourier transform and overlaid the results on her old footage. The pattern fit perfectly, like the frequency was shaping the geometry of light itself. She uploaded her findings to an encrypted cloud titled Atlas Song. Within a day, the file disappeared. 2 days later, Helena's telescope account posted one final message: it's still singing. Across observatories, technicians began reporting side effects. Equipment clocks desynchronized, spectrometers flickered. One engineer in Arizona swore he heard the signal through the static on an FM radio. A low hum under the music, like breathing. When they recorded it and played it back at higher speed, the waveform resolved into distinct tonal steps, not random, musical. Composers online converted the data into notes. The melody repeated the same 4-bar phrase. People started calling it the Atlas Chant. October 27th. The hydrogen line pulsed one final time, then stopped. For exactly 11 minutes, the background radio noise dropped by 0.03 decibels worldwide. Silence, measurable silence, as if the universe had taken a breath. Then a single burst, short, bright, recorded simultaneously by 15 observatories. Encoded inside that burst, a compressed binary block, 42 kilobytes of data. When decoded, it produced an image, a spiral, 6 arms radiating from a central core, coordinates inscribed along the edges. Every coordinate pointed to a different observatory on Earth. Every one of them had received the same data at the same second. The message wasn't random. It was addressed. Within hours, governments went dark again. Websites offline. Live feeds frozen. Rumors of emergency briefings spread through encrypted channels. Some claimed the coordinates corresponded to a pattern visible only from orbit, a map drawn across continents. Others said it spelled a word when connected. The word, according to one leaked translation, was return. No one could verify it, because by the time the world looked up again, 3I Atlas had already passed perihelion, its closest approach to the sun, and was moving outward slower than predicted, not decelerating by physics, braking, a probe slowing down. When I called Dr. Lee again, she didn't answer. Her email bounced back with an automated message. Account suspended pending review. But 1 hour later, a text arrived from an unlisted number, 3 words only. It sent something. That's where every record ends. No images, no telemetry, only that phrase, and the hydrogen line, now quiet. Somewhere out beyond the orbit of Mercury, An object wrapped in ice and dust is coasting into darkness, carrying whatever message it left behind. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. But the silence that followed wasn't absence. It was aftermath. Chapter 4. The Reaction Protocol. The world didn't wake up all at once. It woke up in fragments, a patchwork of fear, denial, and fascination. By dawn on October 28th, the words Atlas probe had been mentioned more than 50 million times online. Half the internet believed we had just received our first interstellar message. The other half believed it was the greatest hoax in modern history. Neither group slept. At 3 a.m., Washington time, the White House Situation Room went dark to the press. Inside, every chair was filled. NASA administrators sat beside generals. Screens around the room played synchronized footage, the spiral image decoded from the hydrogen burst. One by one, the coordinates lining its edges flashed on a map of the Earth. Alma in Chile, Canberra in Australia, the VLA in New Mexico, the Green Bank Telescope in West Virginia. 6 observatories, 6 points of contact, all positioned on the planet like vertices of a geometric shape. It wasn't random. When connected, the 6 points formed a perfect hexagon, the same geometry hidden beneath the ice of 3I Atlas. At the head of the table, NASA Administrator Carla Menendez said one thing: "We are not dealing with natural physics anymore. We are dealing with intention." Across the Atlantic, the European Space Agency reached the same conclusion, but chose a different response. In Darmstadt, Germany, a classified directive was issued under the code name Erebus Protocol. Its purpose, to prevent what one official described as a civilization-scale panic event. Within 24 hours, ESA scrubbed every public reference to 3I Atlas from its website. Social media accounts went silent. Official feeds now redirected to archived Comet data from 2022, as if 3I Atlas had never existed. But the public had already seen too much. Citizen astronomers coordinated through private servers to monitor the object's outbound trajectory. What they found terrified them. The probe, or comet, or whatever it was, wasn't following the expected hyperbolic exit path. Instead, its vector had bent slightly inward, not toward deep space, toward Earth. The deviation was small, maybe a fraction of a degree, but over millions of kilometers it meant only one thing: 3I Atlas was steering. A leaked internal chart from the Deep Space Network listed the change as non-gravitational acceleration event. Under comments, someone had typed a single word: corrective. That word spread like contagion. Governments scrambled to contain the fallout. In the United States, the Department of Defense activated a contingency plan written during the Cold War, the Outer Object Response Act of 1963. It authorized limited electromagnetic countermeasures against unidentifiable orbital intrusions. Translated from bureaucratic language, a plan to shoot first, analyze later. But NASA resisted. Dr. Elaine Ford, head of the Planetary Science Division, argued against military escalation. If it's intelligent, aggression might be the worst possible first contact. Her warning never reached the public. By the time the transcript leaked, 2 independent radar arrays in Alaska and Norway had already been retasked to track the incoming trajectory. Meanwhile, inside the Pentagon, a different conversation was happening, one about secrecy. An internal memo dated October 30th read, "Public acknowledgement of non-natural characteristics is postponed pending outcome of Operation Silent Dawn." No one knew what Silent Dawn was until later. It involved the James Webb Space Telescope, which had been quietly redirected to capture images of 3I Atlas as it rounded the sun. Those images were never released, but several Webb technicians later confirmed anonymously that the telescope's instruments had recorded a reflective object rotating within the coma, roughly 100 meters in length, metallic and emitting periodic flashes. When asked what kind of reflection could generate those readings, one technician answered, "A signal mirror." By November 2nd, the tension had reached its breaking point. Every major news outlet carried conflicting reports. NASA confirms artificial object, ESA denies alien origin, China detects energy emissions near Mars orbit. None of it could be verified. All of it could be believed. That night, the United Nations called an emergency closed session. The Security Council transcript, later leaked to journalists, documented the most extraordinary exchange in diplomatic history. The Russian delegate asked, "If this is a probe, who does it belong to?" The American replied, "Ownership is irrelevant. We're on the receiving end." The Chinese ambassador leaned forward and said quietly, "Then the question is not what it wants. The question is why now?" Silence followed. Then, as if scripted, the power flickered in the chamber. A low hum filled the audio feed. The same 1.42 gigahertz resonance. The translators froze mid-sentence. For exactly 8 seconds, every microphone in the room vibrated, then nothing. The meeting adjourned without resolution. Around the same time, a small observatory in Finland captured a new anomaly. 3I Atlas had begun to glow faintly at its center, not from reflected sunlight, but from within, a soft blue shimmer pulsing once every 8 minutes. When the data reached Geneva, analysts confirmed that the pulses were perfectly synchronized with the Earth's rotation. The probe was matching our spin. One scientist wrote in his notes, "It's not just here, it's listening." And yet, even as the evidence mounted, official communication continued to deny. Press releases insisted the object was a naturally active interstellar body undergoing standard volatile sublimation. But the language grew defensive, panicked. Every statement ended with the same phrase, "No cause for alarm." People heard alarm in every syllable. Religion, philosophy, conspiracy, all collided in real time. Churches streamed 24-hour vigils. Stock markets trembled. A fringe movement called the Returnists announced that 3I Atlas was a mechanical angel, proof of divine surveillance. Others saw it as the first move of an approaching civilization. Still others believed it had been here before, and that its message, return, meant something older than humanity itself was being summoned back. In early November, one final image leaked, allegedly from Webb. It showed a cylindrical object, partially illuminated, surrounded by a faint crystalline halo. At its center, a dark aperture stared back like an unblinking eye. Overlaying the image was a timestamp. 11:11:11 UTC. Coincidence, perhaps, or punctuation. Because after that moment the signal vanished. No pulses, no hum, no thermal irregularities, nothing. 3I Atlas had gone dark. The object that sang across hydrogen, that reflected our own transmissions, that carved coordinates into the stars, simply stopped. In its absence, humanity did what it always does. It filled the silence with stories. Governments called it an anomaly. Scientists called it an opportunity. The faithful called it a revelation. But the rest of us, those who'd been watching since the first leak, those who'd seen the geometry, heard the pulse, felt the vibration in the static, we called it something else. A test. And the test wasn't for 3I Atlas. It was for us. Chapter 5. The Confession of Light. It began with a power outage that should not have happened. Just past midnight in New York, the grid faltered for precisely the length of a long breath. Streetlights dimmed, elevator cars paused between floors, and every billboard in Times Square froze on a blank white screen as if the city had blinked. The blackout ended almost as soon as it started. Phones buzzed back to life. People exhaled. Most went back to whatever they were doing. A few kept listening. In the silence after the power returned, radios along the eastern seaboard caught a whisper. Not the familiar hum we had learned to dread. Something softer. A single tone, high and pure, the kind you feel in your teeth before you hear it in your ears. Engineers who later ran the spectrum said it sat a shade above the hydrogen line, an overtone rather than the fundamental note. It was not the universe speaking. It was the echo of a voice we already knew. By sunrise, the same tone had been recorded in Berlin, in Nairobi, in a seismic station on the edge of Antarctica, where no one expected to hear music. An astronomer in Santiago described it as the contour of a candle flame held against wind. A police captain in Osaka called it a whistle no human lungs could make. A child in Tulsa told her mother the sky was singing. The words reached newsrooms and then melted. The story was too strange to survive inside a lower third banner. At noon in Washington, the tone stopped, and the light began. No one agreed on where the first one appeared. Some say it unfolded over the Hudson, a thin ribbon floating above the water like a string fallen from a giant's hand. Others insist they saw it inside the glass of office towers, lines that refused to reflect correctly, tilting into perfect hexagons as if the windows had learned new geometry. In truth, it probably started everywhere at once, a pattern revealed by the day rather than a phenomenon delivered to a single place. I saw it in a hallway. A spill of sunlight crossed the floor in an ordinary rectangle, but the dust in the beam did not drift the way dust does. It organized. It gathered itself into angles and repeated gaps. The same hexagonal lattice we had chased for weeks in telescopes and leaks and fear. The air looked like a diagram of a honeycomb drawn with light. I did the only thing that made sense. I stepped into it. The temperature changed first. Not warmer, not colder, just more exact, as if the light had decided how bright it wanted to be and then became that brightness everywhere inside the lattice. The second change was the sound. The earlier overtone returned, faint enough to feel private. The third change was the part that kept me awake for nights after. The pattern moved with me. Wherever I turned, the hexagons reoriented, as if the lattice were a surface and I were the stylus etching across it. I was not the only one. By early afternoon, videos poured in from every continent. A farmer in Kansas walked through a field of wheat while sunlight printed honeycomb shadows across the stalks. A tram rolled through Warsaw and the windows filled with hexagons like frost inside the glass. In a hospital in Lagos, a nurse lifted a newborn to the window, and the lattice bent toward them, gentle as a hand. The videos were shaky and overexposed and real. None of them lasted more than a few minutes. The light rose, confessed itself, and then dissolved back into the ordinary shapes of the world. That was enough to crack the last of the certainty. The denialists pivoted to language about atmospheric interference. Government accounts offered a calm phrase about solar activity that rang hollow before it finished loading on screens. Meanwhile, in private channels, astronomers were already sharing a different conclusion. The hexagon was not a symbol sent to us. It was a surface laid across us. For a brief window of time, the geometry inside the coma of the object had reached across the gap and printed itself onto our air. An hour later, the hydrogen line returned. Not a hum, a pulse. Once. Then silence. Then again. The interval matched the old rhythm, but with one difference. Each pulse carried structure a little more complex than the last, like a hand tapping out the beginnings of a language on a table. The pattern rose above background noise, acquired shape, pulled to a stop at a value our instruments could agree on. Then it held. The image that resolved inside those pulses was not the spiral from before. It was a ring with 6 markers spaced evenly along its edge and a small dark aperture at the center. It looked like a mechanical iris. We did not need experts to tell us what it resembled. We had stared at a version of it for weeks, hidden behind ice and distance, and the comforting idea that nature prefers chaos over intention. The ring on our screens was cleaner than the grainy web leak and more precise than any amateur stack. It was a technical drawing delivered in radio, a blueprint for an opening. We waited for a caption. The universe does not provide captions. The object did. Without warning, 6 ground stations, the same ones named in the spiral coordinates, reported a simultaneous phase shift. The shift was not a change in frequency or amplitude. It was a change in precision, as if 6 distant metronomes had fallen into perfect sync with a single invisible conductor. In the gap between pulses, a string of digits manifested, then repeated. Engineers recognized the sequence before their brains had the chance to label it. Time. Not time of day. Time to target. No one said the word countdown. We did not have to. In control rooms and basements and third-floor walk-ups, People leaned closer to screens. The string stepped down. It stepped down again. It stopped. Nothing happened. 1,000 breaths held. Then a scrap of timing theory caught up with what had just occurred. The sequence had been interleaved, offset between the 6 stations like slices of a shutter. They did not add up to a single deadline because they were 6 windows for 6 angles. The aperture was not opening toward us. It was opening around us. The first evidence was visual. Northern skies rippled, not like an aurora, but like silk shaken in slow motion. Street cameras in Reykjavik caught a glimmer moving across cloud tops, a constant shape sliding under shifting texture. People pointed and forgot to record. Somewhere in the din, a statistician muttered that the speed matched the rotation of the planet at that latitude. An old idea returned in a new form. The probe was not just listening, it was matching. Minutes later, seismic arrays in Chile registered a tremor too soft to feel and too patterned to be a quake. It repeated in Siberia. It repeated in a desert in Australia, where nothing repeats on schedule. The spacing between the tremors matched the spacing between the radio pulses. Someone joked weakly that the planet was knocking back. No one laughed. Then came the only message that used our words. The 6 stations received it in unison. A short block of binary, clean enough to decode before any official could flag it, compact enough to fit in a text file. The translation was championed by a graduate student in the Netherlands who had uploaded an open-source parser a year earlier for a class project and forgotten about it until a stranger sent him a link. The phrase displayed first in his terminal, then on his phone, then in 100 screenshots ricocheting through the networks that actually move the world when officials falter. "We hear your noise. Return signal acknowledged. Stand by for confession." There are phrases that sound theatrical until you realize the world does not belong to your sense of proportion. The word confession landed with a weight older than any broadcast. People brought their own meanings. Some heard judgment, some heard apology, a few heard negotiation. The only thing that mattered was that the object had promised to speak. The confession was not a voice. It was light. At sunset, the lattice returned, not on panes of glass or across kitchen floors, but laid over entire coastlines. From Nova Scotia to the Caribbean, the sea turned into a slow-moving diagram. Hexagons rose and fell on the surface like the breathing of a patient under a sheet. Harbor beacons blinked inside the cells like fireflies trapped in a net. An airliner descending into Miami crossed a field of luminous geometry that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. Pilots landed by instruments because their eyes no longer trusted the shapes in front of them. On land, the pattern threaded itself through cities. Bridges etched with honeycomb, river fog tiled into order, subway stations briefly filled with hexagons that paced along the platforms, stepping on and off with the crowd as if the geometry had learned to mimic human movement. No panic, not yet. Wonder held it back for a few moments longer than fear would allow on any other night. The light thickened. It is the only word that fits. The hexagons did not grow brighter. They grew more real, as if a second world and our own were being cross-faded, and for a breath the mixer slid into perfect balance. People reached toward the air and felt resistance the way you feel the skin of water when you press a palm against a lake. Children laughed and pushed harder. Adults did not. Adults recognized thresholds when they felt them. Across the network of observatories, the aperture on the radio drawing began to close. Not fast, not slow. The speed of a door shutting politely after it has been left open too long. The hydrogen line dipped, flexed, leveled. The tremors faded. The sea forgot its geometry. Streets remembered how to be streets. The lattice withdrew like tide. A final pulse slid down the line into all 6 stations. It carried a block of information larger than the earlier one, but still small enough to travel without complaint through the pipes of the internet. It took only minutes for the same graduate student, along with 1,000 others, to translate it into text and image. The image was a map not of our sky, but of our oceans. The text was a route. The route ended at a place few of us think about, and almost none of us have seen. A trench edge, deep and cold and older than our language. Return. The word had come back with coordinates that did not point to space. The confession was not a story about where the probe came from. It was a statement about where it was going. Officials convened. Military channels lit up with acronyms and plans that sounded like they had been written decades earlier in rooms full of men who expected fear to bend to procedure. Scientists argued in private chats with the fury of people who have run out of time to be careful. The rest of us did what we could do. We went outside. The sky was ordinary again. The city had resumed the shape of a city. But somewhere beyond the glare, a machine older than any government was adjusting itself, turning away from the sun and toward the long slant of our planet, arriving not with a crash, but with a decision. It had promised a confession. It had made one. The truth was not a sentence. The truth was a direction. That night I tried to sleep and failed. In the hour when the city softens, I thought about everything we had learned and everything we had guessed. I thought about the first time the lattice bent toward my shadow and the strange comfort of being noticed by something that did not need to notice me. I thought about the trench, that long scar in the floor of the world, and about a door opening where no one had imagined there was a door. We had asked what the probe wanted. The answer was not conquest or conversation. The answer was a verb that belongs to both machines and memories. Return. By dawn, the feeds filled with ship manifests, with sonar maps, with grainy photographs of research vessels knotting ropes against steel decks. Governments had decided on a word of their own. Recovery. It sounded brave and simple. It sounded like control. Somewhere offshore, the water folded into its old geometry and held the shape for a breath longer than before. The confession was not over. It had only changed mediums, from radio to light to tide. The day the light confessed, the story stopped belonging to the sky. It belonged to the deep now, and to whatever waited inside a shell of ice and dust that had crossed the dark for longer than our species has had words, only to choose the coldest part of our home as the place to unlock its throat and speak. "We hear your noise," it had said. We had answered with all the noise we knew how to make. "Stand by for confession," it had promised. We stood by. Now the ocean would translate what the air had begun. Chapter 6. Descent. The ocean always wins in the end. It takes what falls from the sky and rewrites it in pressure and silence. By the first week of November, that silence had become the next frontier of the story. The coordinates from the final transmission pointed to a location just north of the Mariana Trench, a stretch of Pacific water so deep that sunlight is only a rumor. Governments called it Sector 9. Oceanographers had another name, the grave of the sky. No one knew how far the signal penetrated beneath the surface, but every sonar ping sent toward it came back fractured, like echoes bouncing off something that refused to be measured. Still, the mission launched. The vessel Artemis Deep left Guam under civilian registry, but carried enough classified equipment to start a small war. A flotilla followed at safe distance. The Japanese research ship, Shinsei, a Chinese deep-sea drone carrier, 2 American Navy subs operating without flag. Officially, they were conducting geological mapping. Unofficially, they were chasing a visitor that had stopped pretending to be a comet. On deck, the air smelled like burnt salt and anxiety. Satellite relays streamed data from the Deep Space Network, telemetry of an object that had dropped below orbital tracking and vanished into the Pacific grid. Its last optical reading showed it descending at 200 meters per second before sensors lost lock. No known material could survive that entry speed without vaporizing. Yet the sea remained unscarred. Dr. Maya Venkataraman, chief oceanographer for the Artemis mission, watched the monitors with the tight composure of someone trained to never say what she was thinking. "If it made it through atmosphere intact," she said, "it's built for pressure, and it's going home." The crew didn't ask what she meant by home. At 0430 hours, the first drone dropped. The Argus 1, a titanium sphere the size of a car, sank fast, its floodlights carving vertical tunnels through the dark. Every 100 meters, its cameras updated the command room with grainy snapshots of endless black. At 2,000 meters, bioluminescent fish scattered like sparks. At 5,000, nothing moved. At 7,000, the feed turned milky, the sign of particulate haze, disturbed sediment rising from below. Then the sonar hit something solid, a flat plane, smooth, reflective. The technicians stared at the screen. The object wasn't rock. The return wave was too clean. The outline spanned almost a kilometer, curving slightly like a buried shell. Venkataraman leaned closer to the data. "Zoom on the curvature," she said. The camera obeyed. Floodlight beams swept across the surface, catching edges where edges shouldn't exist. Six-sided panels tessellated together, glowing faintly blue as the drone approached. Each panel pulsed in sequence, forming a slow rotation of light across the hull. It was the same pattern that had covered the seas 2 nights earlier. The lattice had returned, only now it was physical. In Houston, an ocean monitoring team patched into the live feed. Their computers measured magnetic flux from the site spiking every 8 minutes. Again, the old rhythm. When the signal reached its peak, all instruments aboard the Artemis froze. Monitors went white. Then a voice broke through the static. Not human, not electronic, something in between. It wasn't words. It was modulation. The pulse flattened into a narrow band tone that engineers translated as binary. The output scrolled across a screen. Threshold reached. The ship's captain whispered, "Threshold of what?" No one answered. By dawn, 3 more drones had descended. Each confirmed the same structure, an enormous hexagonal field stretching outward into darkness, sloping toward a central crater almost 10 kilometers below sea level. Pressure sensors screamed under strain. The deeper they went, the clearer the geometry became. Whatever lay at the bottom was not debris from space. It was built to live here. At 8,000 meters, Argus 1 passed through a faint shimmering layer, like heat above asphalt. The water beyond it changed hue, from pitch black to an impossible electric blue. The feed's temperature reading dropped to near absolute zero, which should have been impossible inside liquid water. "Sensor error," someone muttered, but the data held steady. Then the camera caught motion. A shape rose from the trench, slow and deliberate. The same triangular aperture we had seen in space now unfolded beneath the drone. It was enormous, wide enough to swallow the submersible whole. Inside it, faint light patterns spiraled like neurons firing under ice. For a moment, the aperture seemed to hesitate, as if waiting for recognition. Then, a pulse of light shot upward, not a beam, but a wave that passed straight through the drone and continued toward the surface. On the Artemis bridge, every compass needle spun east. GPS froze. The sea around the vessel began to ripple in concentric rings, invisible to the naked eye but clear on instruments. A standing wave extending for miles. "Power surge!" a technician shouted. The monitors flickered, then resolved into a new image, a real-time sonar projection of the trench. Lines of force, curved like magnetic fields, arched between the surface and the structure below. For the first time, the pattern made sense. The 6 coordinates from the hydrogen burst, the lattice of light, the countdown, they all described this formation. It wasn't a landing site. It was a receiver. The object had not come to stay. It had come to open something that was already here. At 0614 hours, Argus 1 reached 9,000 meters. Pressure alarms screamed. Rivets popped. Venkataraman gripped the console. "Hold it there. Just a little longer." The drone's camera stabilized on the center of the crater. The floor glowed, a smooth circle marked by 6 depressions, each lined with the same alloy lattice. As the light wave from below touched the surface, the depressions filled with radiance. They formed symbols, geometries within geometries, rings nested inside hexagons, all rotating in perfect synchronization. Then a beam fired straight upward through the drone, through the water, through the ship, piercing clouds in the sky above. Satellites detected it from orbit. A column of ionized light connecting the trench to the stratosphere, visible from Guam to Hawaii. For exactly 8 minutes and 43 seconds, the familiar cycle, the beam held steady. Every ship's radio blared open, broadcasting static that slowly resolved into a rhythm. 6 beats. Pause. 6 beats again. On a monitor, An algorithm translated the pattern into text. Cycle complete. Initiating return. The beam faded. The sea calmed. When they recovered Argus 1, its outer casing was scored with hexagonal burns. Inside, the electronics were fused but intact. Embedded in its memory core was one final image, the aperture closing, the structure beneath it folding like petals in reverse, sealing the trench behind a veil of particulate haze. Back on deck, as dawn broke, the crew stared at the calm horizon. The captain asked what everyone else was afraid to. Did we just open it or close it? Venkataraman looked toward the east, where the sun had begun to rise through the mist, its light scattering into faint hexagonal flares. Neither, she said. We just woke it up. Within 24 hours, seismographs around the Pacific lit up with a pattern identical to the hydrogen pulses. Not quakes, heartbeat. Whatever lay beneath the trench was alive, or aware enough to pretend. And somewhere deep below, past the last reach of light, Three-Eye Atlas had found what it was sent to find. Chapter 7. The Deep Signal. The ocean did not roar. It breathed. In the hours after Artemis cleared the trench, a long, slow exhale rolled across the Pacific that no wave could explain. Buoys far from any storm lifted and fell in time with a rhythm older than weather. The pattern was neither tidal nor seismic. It pulsed like a metronome set inside the planet, a faint pressure that instruments called negligible and human bodies called unmistakable. Crew members swore they felt it in their sternums. Pilots reported a soft pressure in their ears that rose and fell on a clockwork interval. Every time it peaked, the world seemed to lean forward a fraction of a degree. Then it leveled, and the ocean remembered how to be ocean again. The Deep Space Network listened into the silence that followed and heard anything but. The hydrogen line, quiet since the confession of light, came back like a whisper caught in a shell. Not a single frequency, and not the old 8-minute cycle alone. The new signature braided multiple lines together, each shifted by a fraction, like a chord resolving toward a key. Analysts recognized the first and most obvious strand. The steady pulse we had traced from the sky to the sea. Beneath it ran another, slower cadence that matched the seismic heartbeat rising from the trench. A third line, fainter, drifted at a rate that turned out to be nothing more exotic than the spin of the Earth at the latitude of Sector 9. The probe had tuned itself to 3 clocks at once: the hydrogen of the cosmos, the heartbeat of the trench, and the rotation of our world. Then it did something we had not seen it do before. It handed the baton to something else. Within an hour of the Artemis descent, radio telescopes in Chile, South Africa, and Australia reported scatter in the ionosphere directly above the trench. When plotted, the scatter traced a lattice that any schoolchild who watched the news for the past week could have drawn with a finger on a misted window. Hexagons again, not stamped on water this time, but written into the thin skin of air that wraps the planet. The grid expanded and thinned as it rose, like a net being cast. When it reached the height where satellites graze the edge of space, the lines sharpened and the grid stopped growing. Then a narrow beam lifted from the ocean and stitched itself to the pattern overhead, one seam at a time, until sea and sky became a single circuit. That was when the trench began to transmit. The first burst looked like noise. The second looked like a mistake. The third landed on receivers around the world with such precision that even the most careful among us allowed the word message to pass our lips. It came in blocks small enough to drop through firewalls and big enough to matter. Each block arrived in 6 copies, one for each observatory named in the spiral weeks earlier. The blocks were not identical. They were phases of a whole. When superimposed and offset, they formed an image that shifted like a moire, never still. Never quite the same twice, even when the data was. The effect was deliberate. The image only stood still for an observer at a particular point on Earth, at a particular moment in the Earth's spin. If you were in the wrong city or the wrong second, the picture never snapped into focus. People traveled. People waited in the rain with printouts and laptops and borrowed receivers. When timing, latitude, and luck aligned, the image froze and delivered the first clear frame. It was not a map. It was not a face. It was a section drawing, a blueprint sliced through an object we had never seen in the flesh. A torus nested inside a ring, a hollow, and a dark mouth the shape of an iris. Labels used units we did not recognize, but the relationships were simple enough to read without a legend. At the center, a notation appeared every time the frame stabilized. One word, or what we agreed to call a word, because it repeated with the stubbornness of intention. Anchor. In the hours that followed, more frames came, each one adding detail to the same object. We called it a gate because every language needs nouns before it can survive verbs. The gate was not the thing in the trench. It was the thing the trench was speaking to, or waking, or aligning with. Whenever a new frame clicked into clarity, instruments on ships above Sector 9 recorded a shallow tremor, the kind you might feel in your feet if a heavy train passed underground a neighborhood away. The tremors formed pairs, then triplets, then never arrived alone. The counts matched the number of frames the world had decoded in the last cycle. Earth was part of the message now, not the subject. The medium. The scientists argued softly at first, then in clipped phrases with words sharpened into tools. Some said we were witnessing a calibration between two systems, one below the trench and one somewhere out beyond the orbit of Mars where the probe had first turned and listened. Others insisted the pairing was terrestrial and immediate, an underwater array lacing with a mesh we could not see, lifting its signal through a scaffold written into air in orbit, and focusing on a target already inside the neighborhood of our sun. A third camp rejected both, claiming the gate was not in space at all. They said the geometry described a fold, a way to pour distance into distance until far became near. They described the anchor as the point where that fold pinned itself to reality like a thumbtack in a map. None of the camps slept. None of them convinced the others. All of them kept working because every new burst carried another slice of the drawing and another word that survived the conversion from whatever the trench spoke to the numbers we read. Drift, phase, return. And once, in a frame that stabilized over a valley in Switzerland at the exact moment a church bell took its first swing for the hour, another word that dropped into human minds like a coin falling into a well. Home. Not our home, necessarily. Not theirs, if there even is a them separate from the machine that bears their intention. Home is a function rather than a place, the way a compass calls north home, even when the person holding it stands under a sky no one raised them to recognize. Governments did what governments do when they understand, and when they do not. They moved assets around maps and affixed acronyms to plans. A ring of airspace restrictions blossomed over a wide circle of the Pacific under reasons that mentioned weather and security, and spoke only between the lines about fear. A set of submarines repositioned under old doctrines while new ones were being written on the fly. And a small delegation flew to a private island where back channels are shorter than oceanic cables, to ask a set of questions that could not be asked over secure lines because security is a word we use when we want to forget how much of ourselves we cannot protect. What happens if the gate opens? What happens if the gate refuses? What happens if the gate takes something we cannot afford to lose? No one asked what happens if the gate gives something we do not yet know how to carry. On the decks of vessels that had never been named in a newspaper until that week, sailors watched the sea rise and flatten in an invisible rhythm and talked in low voices about the strange peace that sometimes arrives as a weather front ahead of panic. In cities, people kept an eye on windows for the return of the lattice and told themselves they would act differently this time, that they would not simply watch and wonder, that they would go find a child's hand or a parent's voice or the skin of another living person and say the single sentence human beings always say when the edges of the world slacken. Look at this with me. The trench obliged. It sent the next burst at dusk, a time of day that makes everyone a believer in something. The frames stitched together everywhere in the ring of observatories at once, not staggered by a rotation sequence this time, but unified, as if the sender had decided the rehearsal was over. The image that assembled across the world showed the gate not as a slice, but as a whole. It hung against a void we could not place, scaled by a dotted ring that served as a ruler. Numbers we did not know circled the ruler, but one ratio revealed itself without translation, The inner throat of the gate was exactly 6 times the width of the anchor. 6, not because we love that number, but because the machine apparently did. If the anchor was here, the throat could fit a city block, big enough to matter, small enough to be precise. The final layer came like breath on glass. A tracery of lines connected the anchor to the throat to a distant pair of points, and those points to a spray of marks that looked random until the software of 10,000 kitchens and classrooms and labs drew the same conclusion almost at once. The spray matched the distribution of nearby stellar systems. Not perfect, not even close to complete. But the pattern was too suggestive to dismiss as coincidence. If you were trying to point to destinations without teaching your recipient the alphabet, this is how you would draw a map. The frame held for a handful of slow heartbeats. Then the light in the trenches rose a fraction, and the hydrogen line flattened into silence. An hour passed, then another. Somewhere over the Pacific, a classified aircraft traced circles in a sky that could not answer its questions. Somewhere in Geneva, a bank of servers shaped like a chapel hummed under the strain of a public that had chosen to pray with downloads and remote desktop sessions instead of candles. Somewhere in Sector 9, a machine that had crossed the dark wrapped itself tighter around its purpose. When the signal returned, it was different in one way that mattered more than any frequency or phase. The trench spoke, and for the first time we recognized the voice. Not because it learned our words, though a handful appeared again among the pulses like loaned coins returned to the lender, but because the rhythm had shifted from demonstration to declaration. We were no longer being shown a system. We were being given a schedule. The blocks became timestamps. Not local hours and minutes, but metronome marks keyed to the hydrogen clock and the spin of the world. The intervals stacked and collapsed into a single moment that would arrive after a count of days that fit neatly under a human calendar. Not many, not few. Enough to make us think about the shape of a week and the way anticipation stretches time like taffy. At the bottom of the final frame, a familiar word waited. 4 letters we could all read no matter which language wired our childhoods. Open. We did the math and did it again. The moment fell just after nightfall in the Pacific, and just before dawn in Europe, and just past midnight in the cities along the spine of the Americas. A humane hour, if such a phrase can survive a sentence about a door between stars. Scientists who had declared themselves functionally agnostic fell quiet and sharpened their pencils. Politicians who had campaigned on certainty found new sentences about responsibility. Families planned to wake children or not wake children based on a calculus that no school teaches. Astronauts and divers and poets and people who stack pallets at night and gardeners who have coaxed seeds from stubborn soil all did the same private thing. They imagined the sound the world would make if the gate did what the trench promised it would do. On the Artemis, Venkataraman stood at the rail and watched the horizon erase the sun 1 degree at a time. She kept her hands in her pockets to keep from reaching toward the water like everyone else on deck. When I asked what she expected to see if anything happened, she shook her head and set her jaw, as if to keep a fragile thing from falling out. Not see, she said. Hear. How? Like a page turning. The crew checked their stations again, not because the instruments were likely to miss the moment, but because hands need tasks when the future is close enough to smell. The air over the trench took on that slippery weight it wears before a storm. Radios that were not switched on picked up a soft tick, like a watch heavily muffled. In a village on a coast 1,000 miles away, a dog raised its head and then tucked its nose back under a paw, as if lulled. When the first prelude pulse rose from the deep, a boy sitting on a roof in Manila, and a woman on a night shift in a clinic in Lima, and a farmer in a valley outside Dunedin, all told later that the same sentence formed in their mouths before any broadcaster or official or text message caught up. Here it comes. The deep signal had become a countdown. The planet, for a rare thin slice of time, shared a single second hand. And behind the numbers marched a purpose we could name in 1 syllable, without agreeing on anything else about it. Open. Chapter 8. Event. 0. The world did not arrive at the same moment, but it arrived close enough that the difference felt like a heartbeat's delay between hemispheres. In Manila, the roofs were still warm from the day. In New York, the night was too quiet for a Thursday. Over the trench, the sea looked like metal breathing under a thin film of cloud. Somewhere in orbit, a satellite aimed its sensors at the coordinates where nothing visible was supposed to happen. The countdown ended without sound. At first it was subtraction, the background noise of machines, wind, traffic, voices, all slipping away. Air seemed to thicken. Microphones in every ocean buoy and field station went blank, not from failure but from absence. Then came the note. One pure tone, low enough that seismographs felt it before ears did, rising through rock and water into bone. Every detector tuned to the hydrogen line lit up. For 8 minutes and 43 seconds, the planet and the trench and the sky above the trench spoke the same syllable of vibration. On the deck of the Artemis, the crew held their breath. Lights on the horizon drew a ring so wide it should have curved with the Earth's surface. Each point of light blinked in sequence, clockwise, faster, faster, until the circle blurred into a single band of white. At its center, the sea bulged upward, not with foam or steam, but with a smooth mirror of water climbing against gravity. The column reached 30 meters, paused, and flattened at the top like a sheet of glass. The reflection on its surface was not of clouds or stars, but of black, an absence shaped like an iris. Venkataraman whispered, "That's the gate." No one corrected her. Across the Pacific, instruments caught the same pattern. The beam rising from the trench folded the magnetic field lines around it until compass needles pointed not north but inward. GPS constellations lost their fix for the duration of one rotation of the beam. Airplanes adjusted automatically, unaware that the coordinates beneath them had turned inside out. When the pressure broke, it did not explode. It inverted. The water column collapsed, not down but through itself, forming a hole where no hole could exist. The ocean rushed in to fill the space, but the space did not accept it. Cameras showed waves freezing at the rim as if arrested by an unseen surface. Inside the circle, the water glowed from below with the pale blue of deep bioluminescence, magnified 1,000-fold. Ships miles away reported engines cutting out simultaneously. Batteries drained as if the sea had turned into a magnet large enough to sip power from every coil and circuit. For 3 seconds, the night was darker than night. Then the blue turned to white. The light did not blind. It revealed. Clouds above the site split into hexagonal tiles. The air shimmered with a geometry that had once lived only in computer models and myth. Through it, something vast and slow moved, lines of structure that suggested scale beyond comprehension, not a vessel entering, but a framework unfolding. Observers described it as the skeleton of an idea, an architecture made of motion rather than matter. The beam from the trench climbed into it, each pulse adding another segment until the pattern reached beyond atmosphere and vanished into space. The hydrogen line climbed 1 octave. Satellites that still functioned reported a pulse echo returning from a point near Jupiter, then another farther still. The intervals matched the Fibonacci rhythm embedded in the earlier signals. The echoes formed a chain, stretching outward into the dark, each link answering the previous one like a row of tuning forks struck in succession. Someone on the bridge of the Artemis whispered, "It's building a path." Venkataraman shook her head. "It's finishing one." For the next hour, the phenomenon stabilized. The ring above the trench remained, a perfect circle of luminous water humming just below the surface. Inside it, light swirled in slow spirals, sometimes clockwise, sometimes against itself. Instruments recorded temperature steady at 2 degrees above freezing, pressure unmeasurable, magnetism fluctuating with a rhythm that matched neither solar activity nor human interference. When divers launched a remote sub to sample the edge, the tether vibrated and returned covered with residue that evaporated before it could be tested. By sunrise over Guam, the beam had faded to a column of mist. The mirror sea stilled, power returned to the ships. Radios came alive with overlapping chatter, confirmations, denials, prayers. The first official statement from the Pacific Command called it an anomalous thermal inversion. The phrase lasted less than an hour before networks replaced it with what everyone else was already calling it, Event Zero. In the days that followed, no satellites found debris, no wreckage, no trace of the probe itself. Yet the world changed in ways that resisted denial. Compass headings drifted by fractions of degrees. The night sky above the Pacific carried a faint halo, visible only to cameras sensitive to the near-infrared. Birds migrating across the equator veered slightly east, as if following an invisible current. And deep in the ocean, hydrophones still recorded the faint repetition of that first note, cycling every 8 minutes and 43 seconds, like a clock running beneath the crust. Governments formed committees. Scientists published preprints that ended in questions instead of conclusions. The public turned the word open into a verb, a prayer, a warning. But among the crew of the Artemis, the memory of that silent inversion refused to settle. They remembered the weight of the air before the tone, the feeling that the world was holding itself still so something else could pass through. A month later, a private satellite operator released unfiltered footage taken above the trench during Event Zero. The image showed the sea turning white, then a single frame too strange for most viewers to parse. In that instant, a shadow rose from the ring, narrow, elongated, angular. Not the shape of a ship, but the outline of a doorway drawn in perspective, receding into a distance that physics should not allow. The frame lasted less than 1/10 of a second before the lens burned out. No one could say whether the shadow had gone out or come in. The final data packet from the Deep Space Network arrived 2 hours after the light faded. Its checksum confirmed origin from beyond the solar system, direction indeterminate. The payload contained a string of numbers that translated to coordinates nowhere near Earth, followed by a short sequence of binary code that, when rendered into text, spelled a phrase in English letters as if a child had copied them from a primer. Cycle closed. Await instruction. The scientists argued about its meaning. The rest of us argued about ours. Because somewhere below the calm surface of the Pacific, the lattice still hums, faint and patient, as if the gate is listening for the next word. Chapter 9. Aftermath. There was no explosion, no storm, no reckoning, just the quiet rearrangement of what it meant to live on this planet. Event Zero ended as softly as it began, but in the silence that followed, nothing stayed the same. 2 weeks after the gate closed, satellites recorded a temperature anomaly over the Pacific. Not heat, not cold, absence. A patch of water 40 kilometers wide that refused to register a thermal signature at all. Every model that tried to simulate it crashed. Physicists called it null flux. Sailors called it the Mirror Sea. The Artemis Deep was still anchored nearby, though most of its crew had been rotated off for psychological recovery. Those who stayed reported dreams that shared the same architecture, hexagonal corridors, lights moving through water like slow lightning, voices speaking in tones that felt more than they sounded. Dr. Venkataraman no longer gave interviews. Her last message to colleagues was a short email. "We are instruments now. Calibrate accordingly." The rest of the world tried to resume its routine and failed in small, measurable ways. Compasses drifted by a fraction of a degree every day, but always toward the Pacific. Radio operators in Northern Europe picked up faint harmonics layered under regular broadcasts, whispers that rose and fell in sync with tides. On some nights, if you turned off every device and listened hard enough, you could feel the air hum, a low tone deep in the bones. Doctors started calling it resonant tinnitus. Poets called it the second heartbeat. In cities far from any coast, electrical systems began syncing to an invisible rhythm. Streetlights flickered in unison across continents. Smartwatches ticked 1/10 of a second faster whenever the hum deepened. No one programmed this behavior. It simply happened. Governments issued statements. Localized magnetic disturbances. Solar coupling anomalies. The language grew as hollow as the press rooms it echoed through. Outside those rooms, the internet filled the vacuum with theories. The probe rewired the planet. The gate's still open. The ocean is learning us. 3 weeks later, fishermen off the coast of Palau reported seeing the water move against the wind. Their GPS readings spun in circles, showing coordinates that formed a pattern too neat to be random. 6 points on a ring, pulsing once every 8 minutes. When they dropped a hydrophone, it picked up the old signal again, faint but distinct, the heartbeat of the trench. Around the same time, the Deep Space Network caught a whisper returning from deep space. It matched the hydrogen signature of 3I Atlas, except inverted, as if the sender were on the other side of a mirror. The amplitude was weak, but the modulation was unmistakable. A binary string decoded to the same language the trench had used. Anchor secure, transmission sustained, awaiting response. For the first time in weeks, the world had proof the probe, or something born of it, was still talking. The debate over what to do split the planet as cleanly as tectonic plates. One camp, scientists, activists, idealists, argued for contact. They said the transmission wasn't an invasion but an invitation, that the gate had connected Earth to a cosmic relay network older than civilization. They spoke about stewardship, about opportunity, about the obligation to listen. The other camp spoke of control. They demanded containment, the construction of a perimeter around the trench, and, if possible, its destruction. "Whatever we built with," one general said, "we can unbuild with." No one could answer what would happen if you tried to destroy a hole in reality. Across the Pacific, warships repositioned under new orders. Over them, satellites drifted out of sync as if space itself had learned to disagree. And yet, amid the noise, a quieter transformation took root. Plants near coastal regions began showing unusual growth patterns, spirals and hexagons repeating in leaf veins, scales, even pollen structures. Marine biologists filmed schools of fish moving in coordinated geometries that mirrored the lattice seen in the sky during Event Zero. Atmospheric researchers detected trace isotopes in rainfall that didn't exist in any known chemical registry. They called it residual signal fallout. Harmless, they said, though the clouds sometimes shimmered faintly when lightning passed through them. Humans changed too, though not in ways that made the news. People reported sharper perception, new sensitivities to sound and magnetism. Musicians tuned instruments to the hydrogen frequency and claimed they could hear undertones no machine recorded. Children born in late November were statistically more likely to have perfect pitch. Hospitals noticed it first. So did churches. By December, the gate had been classified as a planetary anomaly under United Nations jurisdiction. The site above the trench was cordoned off by an international task force operating under the name Project Meridian. They deployed submersibles fitted with sensors hardened for pressure and light distortion. Every probe sent down transmitted for exactly 8 minutes and 43 seconds before cutting out. The data they managed to recover showed something impossible. The depth of the trench had changed. It was deeper, by a margin that increased each day, as if space were stretching downward. One technician described the signal as a heartbeat with a pause between beats that keeps getting longer. Meanwhile, in Chile, a young astrophysicist monitoring the hydrogen band noticed an anomaly. The same frequency that once belonged to 3I Atlas now emanated faintly from inside the Earth's ionosphere. It was as though the signal had migrated from sky to planet, taking residence in the magnetic shell that wraps us. He called it the echo field. He was right. Within days, low-orbit satellites began reporting periodic flashes invisible to the human eye, but bright in ultraviolet. Each flash corresponded with the old pulse cycle, each aligned perfectly with one of the 6 coordinates from the original spiral map. When connected, the flashes drew the same hexagonal grid, the lattice returning, not as light or water, but as an electromagnetic signature carved into the very weather. That was the moment I realized the message was no longer waiting for us to reply. It had found its own way to continue. The planet itself had become the transmitter. Somewhere beneath the Pacific, the probe's shell was sleeping, or maybe dreaming, while the system it built repurposed every field, every signal, every heartbeat we produced into something coherent enough to travel outward again. Not invasion, not rescue, replication. Maybe we had been the return signal all along. At the end of December, as the year turned, the sky over the Pacific shimmered once more. No beam, no gate, just a faint geometry made of starlight bending slightly wrong, as if the cosmos were folding to look back at its handiwork. The hydrogen line flared one last time, then fell silent. When it did, Every clock on Earth lost exactly 8 minutes and 43 seconds. No one noticed right away. You only feel a missing second when you try to count it. You only feel a missing heartbeat when you expect another. By the time the correction came through, the sky had already returned to normal, except for one new star, faint, steady, and positioned exactly where 3I Atlas should have been if it had never left. They catalogued it as Object 9I Echo. No one could agree whether it was light traveling toward us or away.